Okay, so I'm recording. So please feel free to ask questions. So the question I have had in the last week or so is, when are we going to see the coursework? Can we get on with the coursework? Now I'm going to put this in kind of discreetly as I can. Week 7 material is essentially your coursework beginning. What you'll have to do with it is, once you build week 7's material, and we'll go through it, and I'm going to pick out in this lecture what the key concept is. Wasn't I due ages ago? Oh, sorry, Daniel, you're talking to Tom, I hope, not to me. Okay. Yeah, and those who have applied for it, Charlotte says. Okay, sorry, questions about ECF. I'm not sure in the video recording people can see the chat, so I'll just try to keep focus on what we're doing, but please feel free to ask questions as normal. So this is the basic logic of what I want to do is, and this is how I have done it. I've rewritten the coursework. It's going to be moderated, first of all. So I'm rewriting, it's getting moderated at the moment, but we all agree, and I think some of you do as well, is that it would be really helpful if you could see the coursework really early and get on with it. You've got a 3-week gap in front of you. So what I have done is I have rebuilt this week 7's material. Week 7 is officially the first week you get back in April, but I'm releasing it now because I think that the best strategy you could have is you work through week 7's material. I'll spell out the shape of it, what's going on, what it's about, what the big deal, what the concept at the heart of it is. And then I'll explain that with the coursework, you will have to refactor some of the names of the classes, but pretty much everything else you do for this week 7 can be adapted with a few renaming of functions and methods. I've deliberately chosen material in week 7 that if you work through and do, you've basically started a version of your coursework. When you get the coursework, obviously it will look slightly different than just lecture notes. It will be in the form of, it'll look different. It'll specify and give you some more constraints. Yeah, and so hang on, so give me just 2 seconds, John. There is no worksheet that you will do separately for it. 7A and 7B are essentially the lecture notes, which are practical work through examples. And I'm going to just kind of work through a very simple, a quick version of it in this lecture, and hopefully answer your questions as well. So let's have a look. So this 7A worksheet is a worksheet that will very much help with our coursework, but is otherwise just a normal weekly worksheet. Yeah, so just to be clear, it isn't technically a worksheet. We won't separately mark it. Week 6 is the last week worth of worksheets you're doing. Yeah, and so let me come to the video question in a second, William. So Charlotte, this is like any other week. The 7A and 7B are stuff that you will have worked through. At the moment, I haven't put any videos for them because I wanted to get the material to you and talk about it in this lecture in time for you just to get on with it. And then in next week, I'll record short videos and talk through it. But because so much of it is almost like an early giveaway of the kind of thing you're doing, so the coursework will either be released the week before we come back or in the first week we come back. The deadline will either be the 13th or the 12th. There's a rule about 13th or 12th of May, that is. So the release date, I've talked to Matthew about it. If I can get it sorted out, then I'm looking at it just a few days before we get back in Easter to give you time on your practical on Monday to ask questions about it. No, so there's no more worksheet 6. The worksheet, this reverse engineering one, will be the last one you'll have marked. Having said that, the learning catalytics, however, Matthew wants us to do two more weeks after Easter. So we've got 2 more catalytic bingo. I'll keep them, I'll keep them light. And actually what I'm going to do with the content of it, yes, I will do. Give me 2 seconds, Charlotte. I'll just make a note to do that. So with the catalytic, with the learning catalytics, I'm going to take the questions related to the things you need to be able to do in the coursework. So I'll try to tie them together a little bit more. Okay, so just to make it clear, I haven't confirmed a date that I'm releasing it, but let's just grab a calendar very quickly and see if I can give you some kind of indication of what I'm trying to do here. So we are currently, okay, ignore all that stuff. We are back on the week beginning the 19th, that week there. I'm moving it very quickly because I don't want you to read all the junk that I have on my calendar, right? But what I'm trying to do is release it to you before we get back on that 19th. My ideal would be to perhaps release it the week before at some point. So you've got time to read it, got time to digest it. It's actually at the moment quite a long document. It isn't actually hugely complicated. If you've been following, and I'll tell you why, I don't think there's nothing, after week 7, there's nothing new in it. It is literally applying this material in week 7. Hang on, let me finish off answering Charlotte's question. Yeah, so I'm hoping to release it then. The deadline will be, I think I've set it for the 13th of May. I'll have to double check that, which is one day before the last deadline date, before the exam period. Matthew wanted me to make it a day or so earlier than that, but I want to try to do it so the Thursday morning practical students get one last chat if they have and they're stuck with something, they get one last session in that morning. So everyone gets a fair number of practical discussions. And what we're going to do with the practicals after Easter is, other than next week, other than the very first week going through worksheet 6A, it's all over to you to get on with your coursework and ask for our help. The rules will be simple. We don't want to build your coursework for you, but we want to support you when you get stuck with things. So it will be a much more, you have a question, come to the practicals, we'll try to answer them type of approach. Okay, so I hope that answered your question, Charlotte, and anyone who's watching this in the recording. Okay, so let's move into the material. So especially for those who are absent, perhaps the critical element of this is this concept called composition, the one that I've highlighted. What this first sheet does is it talks about what I call the server objects, and that's what we'll focus on in the first 5-10 minutes of this session when I show you some code. Well, we'll code a version of what we're talking about, right? It talks about what the client-server split is. This split is fundamental. Let me maximize the screen. It's fundamental for the coursework. In the coursework, you must make sure, now this, for those of you who have been keeping up, it should be reasonably straightforward. So the client objects are your place where you have your main and your console helper. So whatever you call it, console library, whatever. Now, a couple of questions have appeared. Do you have to use your console? Matthew is changing it, Mark. He's changing the learning catalytics to make sure that he picks fewer of your best ones to contribute towards that 10%, if that makes sense. So what his logic is that, say you do 10 overall across the whole year, he wants to take your best X, and X was, I think initially it was the best 10, but I think he's reducing that number to the best 7 or 8. He'll get back to you about it. So your worst 3, or the ones you were absent, he won't look at. Okay, just sorry about that for those who listen to this. So the client objects are all to do with your front end. On the second sheet, that's all covered here in the second one. In the first one, I'm going to focus on this back end stuff, right? So the purpose of it is to lay out a problem. I would recommend you go through this personally, because all the code snippets are built from code I built in the process of making this for you. Nearly everything I supply to you can be adapted for your coursework. This logic here, you won't need to, but this part of a process, part of the thinking process, thing called smart light switch. I ask you as an exercise to build it, then I'll give you supplied code for you to see how it would look, and on we go and we work. So there's lots of code in here to help you work your way through it, and there will be videos as well. So this will focus on what we call the server objects. Then the next one, which I need to cover very briefly in this lecture, is all about the front end stuff. So I've called it a dashboard. You'll notice in the coursework, you'll have something called a dashboard. In your dashboard is where your, let me maximize that screen, where your public main void will sit. And I'll explain that. So if you look at this example, I create my console support and I create my server objects inside here. And all of this will be talked through. They're all talked through. Some of you have also asked about this topic here, exception handling. If you have errors for input. Now, several of you have tried to build some structure. I kind of built something to show you that you are welcome to use. And when we get to it, I'll show it to you. And incidentally, the other thing to note about this week is that the logical sequence is week 3 you need to be confident with, then the material from week 5, because this builds on week 5. Okay, so if you struggle with this material and you get confused, go back to week 5 and make sure you're clear about it. Okay, and I'm going to rehearse that gap in that concept in a minute. But there's stuff about where was I? Exception handling, giving you a mechanism for it, and I give you some code. Where is it somewhere? That's a try catch. No, I had an example. I'm sure I have it somewhere here. There we are. That provides you with what's called a recursive. If you remember your Python, you had some of you wrote while loops, and when you got incorrect input, you made them re-enter the correct input. Now I've introduced the concept in one of the worksheets of recursion through the sort example, I think it was. Have a look at that. And what that is you, for example, you're trying to get integer input, right? So you set your scanner up, you declare your variable, you've got a prompt out to the user. Then you try to grab your integer. Let's say that a person, instead of passing an integer, passes you a string or a letter. What happens is that within this bracket, this try bracket, if this gets the wrong input, it throws an exception. The code jumps into this bit of code and it does a really peculiar thing. It actually calls the same method recursively. So what happens is it leaps back and then it asks you again to re-enter the input. Now, I haven't put in here, really, you could put an extra message. Let me just put a little gap in there. You could put some extra messages here, right up here, to make this work. So you can put some extra messages. You've entered the incorrect thing. Then the logic of this, that's good. The logic of this approach is that recursively doesn't require while loops. This will carry on running until someone enters the correct input. Anyway, I wanted to give you some exception handling. I just need to reassure you that the code is not going to, the grading around exception handling is nil. So it won't have a negative impact if you don't put a lot of exception handling. When you see how it's graded, you'll see that I will assume largely that correct input is coming in. Okay, but for those of you who are fascinated and want to do something, that's a really nice place to start using recursion. Anyway, so the second sheet, 7b, is all about what goes on the dashboard, the front end. You create your objects, you create this thing called a smart building, which I'm going to explain in a minute. There's a big gap. Let's just close that gap. Hang on a second. Right, I'll give you a sample of week 5 code. Then we adapt the week 5 code into the week 7 code. And so you can see what the differences are between week 5 and week 7. And hopefully you can see what the differences are in terms of how you would code it. A ton of this material, all of this, and this bit down here about menu options, which I'll explain in a minute, right? This is actually a part of your coursework. So you're going to just, if you go through this systematically and build it, then you will, and just to make it, last time I'll say, I hope, and I endlessly repeat myself, you'll basically be building a version of your coursework, right? So let's get started with it, and you throw questions at me if you want to. Right, that is the code that I built, which I don't really want to give you, otherwise it's giving you too much. That would be a bit lazy. I'm just creating a raw project here. What we're going to do is talk you through the concepts. Okay, so in this project, I just have something called a dashboard. That's the name of the class with my main. So here's my first question. I have a couple of questions, and I'm going to put these into the learning catalytics anyway, so I'll ask them anyway. Should all Java classes have public static mains in them? What do we think about that question? No, no. Oh, who said yes? Borges, you said yes. Well, okay, not necessarily. Strictly, that's technically probably the most correct answer, but no is absolutely. This very interesting concept and very useful for many applications other than just the, but I need to practice it, composition. Okay, I'll get to composition in a second, Gabriel, just wait. Zachary, you're absolutely right. That's the point. The point is you only have one of these in your desktop application, right? So whenever you build your server objects, they shouldn't have them in there because they don't need them. This is your, someone has said correctly, who said it? Tom has said it's your single entry point for your application. That's all you need, and that's all you'll need for your coursework. It's no trick by telling you that in the coursework, I call the same thing dashboard, right? Okay, so here, in here, we're going to build our objects, two objects that we're going to build. Now, there is a question, there is a requirement, incidentally, and it's worth 10% in your coursework of having a console helper, okay? So for those of you who've built themselves console helpers and started to use them, you've also built part of your coursework. I hope I made that clear earlier. Okay, yeah. Well, it doesn't need a main in every class, Tom, so I'm not quite sure what you mean. No, you do have an exam, Mogis, you do. But it will be based, as I said, largely on the learning catalytic type questions I was doing with you. No, Gabriel, you definitely don't want to create a main to debug a backend, right? Because you've got to keep in your mind this concept. Let me just get this concept. This is absolutely fundamental to you. This one here, this separation between the client, think of it over here, and the server over here. Now, I'm emphasizing this because the grading criteria will be this, and bear this in mind. If you put front-end stuff like console interaction into your back-end objects, you'll lose points. Okay, if you manage your data for your array, essentially we're dealing with an array inside an object, right? That's the crucial concept from week 5, but we're adapting it. If you basically do all that work on your client, you'll lose points. You have to maintain in your mind a clear separation. Part of my aim is to try to make this as clear as possible, and this would be a question. Yeah, exactly. The client would be where you debug the backend. That's right. So as Gabriel, in your language of backend, this, what I'm circling with my cursor is your backend. This is your front end. This is where you're testing stuff. It's where you're checking your objects create and so on and so forth, right? So let's get on and do some of that. Okay, in my files, I'm going to create 2 classes. Robert, honestly, I can't remember. I can't remember what you showed me. But don't worry, because the grading criteria is clear. What I will do with the coursework is I will record a short video, talk it through, okay? It might be the abstraction thing. I've had a couple of students this week who've kind of mixed them together. You know, they've got all their class stuff inside the main and it's all got muddled up because it's all worksheet. For your coursework, you need to drop the concept of a worksheet and treat each of them, even where your main is, as a distinct entity, okay? Right, so I'm going to create 2 classes, one called Smart Building. Now, this is only going to start you off with 7A, but I want to pick the key concept called composition and what it's all about. So that's what I'm going to do. This sheet, 7A, actually takes you through it much more systematically. The logic of the way I've constructed this material is that I start with some basic solution which doesn't work and slowly, step by step, take you towards composition. I haven't got time in the lecture to go through all of that detail, so I'm just going to rush you straight through to the main concept, okay? But it's to your advantage to work through it to make sure you get it. Right, where was I? I was here somewhere, right? I was creating an object and I seem to stop. Right, so we've got Smart Building. and we'll explain what that means. That's one object. And the second object is going to be smart light switch. And I'm going to explain what I mean by both of these, right? So first of all, let's start with a smart light switch. What we have is a system. The problem is we want a system where we have a building and it has a number of smart light switches that you can remotely control through, say, an app, like an Amazon plug. Oops, plug is a clue for what the coursework does. In this sheet, we're dealing with light switches. Anyway, stick to light switches. You only have to refactor what you're doing and then extend what we're on about. Okay, hopefully you're still with me. Please ask if you're not. So I don't want to confuse you in the process. Right, so I have a bunch of smart light switches and I have a smart building. Now, in week 5, we had the idea that you could have an integer array. So, you know, I could call it IA. And that would be, and I would put the word private inside it. And I would manage that integer array. That's week 5 stuff, right? So if you forget the detail of it, the crucial concept was that all the public methods, so whatever you put down here, I don't know, let's just say int get value, you passed it, I don't know, an index. I don't actually know if we built this one. And you would have methods like this. They were prefaced with the word public, which meant it was part of the object interface. It would have a name, it gives something back, and this interacted with your arrays. So here, for example, I would just return that. That's what that's saying. For example, that's a very, very simplistic and simple method, right? Obviously, I haven't got a constructor. I haven't got any basic machinery inside my class. But the crucial concept is I have an array of integers, okay? Now, what does composition do? Composition deals with a level of complexity that this kind of thing can't solve, right? So what the problem here is that if I wanted to manage this array of integers, now hopefully a lot of you here have already gone through week 5's sheet. Maybe you've attempted this week's week 6 stuff, the breakout room exercise. If you have, on week 6, I've also released the solution so you can compare. Did I want to do that? Yeah, I did the breakout room. I did want to do that. Sorry. Yes, that's visible to you. So you can compare the breakout exercise with how you coded it versus a version of the code for you to look at that I produced. So you can compare and check and make sure you're confident. You've got to be, to go forward, confident with what I'm talking about. If you're not, don't shut down at this stage. Stick with it, right? Just even if you can grab a glimmer of the concept that I'm going to introduce, but recognize you need to go back to week 5 and strengthen that before you hit week 7, okay? You've got Easter in front of you. The problem with this one is that it only holds whole numbers. Now, let's imagine I had a smart building and I had a bunch of smart lights. And essentially every smart light, let's get rid of that, right? Every smart light in this array that I'm holding has a Boolean value. It can be true or false. So think of it like a little app I have, and I can turn off and on different light switches. So crudely put, that's a way you could manage it, right? Could you like make it so you could do private smart light switch? No, I don't even, no. Okay, I do see what you're saying. Almost. Hold that thought. You're almost there, Ethan. You're almost there, right? But just see if you can grasp what I'm going to do, right? You're very close. I think I know what you're asking me. Okay, the issue here, and we've always got to ask ourselves, why have a new concept unless it solves a specific problem? So the problem I lay out in the lecture notes are this. Well, having just true or false values in an array is good. It gets you so far. But let's say that each light has an IP address attached to it, or it has a room attached to it, or it has some other information attached to each of the lights. The problem is a Boolean on its own won't make it work, okay? RGB lights, yeah. What we have to start thinking is that we want an object which will manage an individual light, okay? So we create an individual light class. And what this is going to hold two pieces of information, Boolean status value, and let's just say that, crudely put, because I can't remember, what did I actually put in the lecture notes? Give me a sec. A status and a location. Okay, so I've got a really odd way, but I've kind of used a double value as a location just because it was simple. So the whole number in the double is the room, and after the decimal point, it's the individual light switch in that room. Look at the lecture notes, you'll see what I'm trying to get at. I built all of last year's coursework around that. I've abandoned that for the coursework, but for this exercise, it's quite a good way of just sticking to numbers. And the other thing that you'll notice in these lecture notes is that I will try to stop you from constantly entering stuff into the interface other than integers. You know, if you have to enter true or false, enter 1 and 0 and convert it through your console helper into true or false and pass it to your server object. Do that type of strategy. You'll see when you spot the coursework, when it's handed out, you'll see that that's built into it to encourage you to do that. Why do I do that? I suppose the simple point is that what we should really be teaching you, hang on a second, Hector, I'll get to your question. Why are we doing that? Because really the front end should be graphical user interface. It shouldn't be a console, right? So we need to stick to the simplest way of getting input and output. So if the smart light switch is server side, why is the class public and not private? If the class is private, no one can see it. The class has to be declared as public, otherwise it's invisible, okay, to anything outside of it. Think of the public and private word in terms of the concept of an interface. This smart light, if it's public, it means that you can interface with it. You can interface with this object. You can do stuff with it, right? You can create it. If it's private, it's invisible. It's a question someone asked weeks ago. Why would you bother putting public when they're always going to be public? Classes are. Yeah, Hector, that's a good way of putting it. Right, so everything you want to hide is private. Everything you want to make visible, which forms the interface, think of it like this. There's your data being stored inside your smart light switch. Everything to get access, to update it, to display it, etc., creates your interface, and your interface manages your data. So bear with me a second. Okay, so this is the other reason that you don't have to worry about building classes quickly, because if you just add those two values, right click it and go to generate. Apologies to those. No, take it with you. Take it with you. Sorry, it's got a dog in the thing. You might start barking. Apologies to those who are using Visual Studio Code, VS Code. IntelliJ does this really nice thing where you can generate. There we go. Right, useless animal. Right, let me just put my getters and setters. It has now created my part of my public interface. Right, thought she would bark. Right, sorry about that, folks. Right, so just by hitting the generate button, I can build my public interface. If I also hit my generate, I can build my constructor. I can select my two variables, and I've got my constructor. Right, that took less than 10 seconds. You'll notice that in the coursework, we shouldn't be a console, Snickers, yeah. Yeah, I mean, Brenda, my point is that we're doing it through a kind of menu of programming, a procedural interface, console interface. Really, Matthew and I have been talking about it, and comp science students next year will get to do graphical user interface, as will software engineers, because you do everything through graphical user interfaces, pretty much. But we should be really been doing this with a graphical user interface. So I don't want you to get lost. My point is, I don't want to mark it, and I don't want you to get lost with kind of string input, checking string input, because on a graphical user interface, you can often just select stuff, right? No, we won't be using any GUI stuff. There's an explicit thing not to. Okay. Okay, Ethan, you're rushing ahead, but maybe a bit too fast. You've got to follow this because we're dealing with arrays, not individual values. We have a smart light switch object. Okay, now let's come back to our smart building. And instead of a Boolean, I'm going to replace that with the smart light switch. And now what I have is an array of objects, which means that this smart building class works pretty much like the week 5 material, but you have to just add another layer to get access to the values inside the smart light switch. So for example, some of you did the sort in the group breakout exercise, right? And when you had an integer array, you just worked with the array directly. But with this, when you have an object, you have to decide which value you want to sort it on inside the object. Now, I'm not going to go into that here, because in the lecture notes, I go through the basic template of how you would approach it, and I give you some sample code for it. That is the absolute crucial concept. That's called composition, right? What you're talking about, Ethan, is composition, but you're treating it too much as an isolated entity. I'm interested in an array of objects, which I'm managing inside this smart building. That's the connection between week 3, week 5, and week 7. And so look really carefully at the way that I'm working at those two concepts together. Okay, so that's my first pause. That's essentially what you're going to be doing in your coursework. You are going to be building a something like a smart light switch, right? And you will be placing an array of it in another structure, another class, another object. These two parts constitute your server, right? Inside, they're not allowed, they're not permitted to have any console interaction. How do you use them? Well, let's create a few bits and pieces first of all, so we can, let's get rid of that. Let's create a constructor so we can build our smart light, our smart building. So with a constructor, it's the same name as the object smart building. I'm going to pass it, and if you look at week 5 material, you'll find this is exactly the same thing. I get my smart lights and I do that, and that will create an array in exactly the same way as if it would work if it's an integer array. But because the object is not an integer here, the type is not an integer, it's my object, it doesn't add anything else. The concept remains the same. So it's nice and simple. We come back to our dashboard, come over here. Now, here's a crucial concept. I do not know how many times I might have to say this. But okay, so I'm going to create my smart building. Let's just say I'll call it my house, right? And I create it, right? But in that bracket is expecting a size. So I need to have a size. I mean, I could just put a number in there, but actually what the coursework needs you to do is go and get it from the user. So currently I don't have a, unhelpfully, a console helper. So I'm going to knock one together very quickly. And for those of you who thought console helpers are a cheat, they're not, because they're actually part of the structure and the architecture of this. And they exist because, let's just quickly do this, right? So it's public, void. I use out rather than print. And what am I going to print? I'm going to just keep this to a string. Let's have the prompt that we're going to pop into there. And then let's stop system out print line prompt. That's it. And thankfully it's built it really quickly for me. Let's just do a get int, right? Which would be a logical one. Public void. No, we want public int because I want to return from here. And I'm going to say get int. Now, most of you have this, okay? I would like to think most of you already gone ahead and built all this as part of the work so far. For those of you who are hanging back and thinking, no, I don't want to do that. You know, it's I want the scanner here. Those of you who weren't, just understand that me banging on about it is because you've got it in your coursework, right? And there's a good logical reason that you've got it in your coursework. I'll get the import will work in a second, right? So what am I doing? I am calling my out, passing its prompt to it. Then I'm simply returning in dot get, oh no, it's next, isn't it? It's next int. There we go. Wake up. Right. And it's not able to see it because it can't spot the object, so it can't help me code complete. If I do that, import the class. So at the top, it has the scanner import. Okay, so there's a simple get int, right? You're going to already have this stuff in here. So it's not a big deal. It's not that difficult. So let's come back to my dashboard and I would do this. There's two ways you could do it. Because this is receiving the integer, you could actually just type in here. Oh wait, we need our object first. Now, a couple of students asked, can we use the console helper as a static class, or do we have to use it as an object? If you use it as a static class, you can't pass it, attach to it your house, your server object, and make your interface much simpler. You'd have to keep on passing in the house as a parameter. If you make it as an object, you have an ability to attach it. So it's up to you. I'm doubly reading the coursework, so I don't stop you if you want to use it as a static class. I'm not going to, because I think from your point of view, especially if you go into other platforms, you're going to find just being consistent with objects is a nice way of doing it. So I'm just going to create an object from my console. Remember, if I wanted to do it, I'd use the static keyword, all that jazz. That's your decision. It's not determined. Now, if I come into here, I can actually go console get int and pass it a prompt. So it needs a bit of text. It says, please enter array size. Okay, there's nothing fancy or special in it. All I've done is I've inserted that into the parameter. So that function call, and now this is slightly different. I'm not sure if I've shown this before, but that function call returns an integer, but I'm not storing it as an integer. I'm passing it straight in as a parameter by placing that there. It means that it'll pop on screen, please enter an array size, and then straight away it will pass it into the constructor. It'll come over to the constructor and build an empty smart lights array. Okay, so that's how you would initialize it. How would you populate it? And then how would you display it? Now, one of the things that I'm going to get you to do is this. And when I told Matthew this, he sort of shrieked at me. You're going to do this, okay, if you can see what I'm doing. So I would recommend that you do it for this exercise as well. You display the content of inside your smart building. So what's inside here? How do I get hold of the data inside my smart light? Now this, infinite, yeah, okay, yeah. Bear with it, Zachary, you can use a Boolean, but this is just to replicate something like an interface. Having an infinite loop is just so you can make a change, you hit enter, the screen gets updated. It's the nearest thing to a graphical user interface without having one. Okay, so that's why, painful that they are, it's there. So this, what I'm going to show you is a very important strategy. I want to display the content of these smart lights, but I can't do it all from the smart building. I need to ask each of the smart lights to give me that information back. So if I come to back to the smart light switch, now this is a strategy that you will see at the bottom of week 7. It's a strategy that I will show you. You always give responsibility to the object to do. So this smart light switch does have a get status and a get location. I could use that, convert them to strings, okay? Yeah, but don't worry, Brendan, it's not a requirement in this instance. So, well, let's keep it simple. What you really want to get through the end of this year is a decent grade and an enjoyable coursework. That's my instinct. So you don't need to make it any more complicated than it needs to be. And I certainly am not expecting that, not this year. Of all the years that people have had to get through, I'm still slightly confused by the use of the word this. Okay. See this line up here? It's a good example of this. What does this mean? Well, this, how can I say? I don't know. Can someone think of a good way of explaining it? Look, I've used the same name as a parameter and as the variable. Some of the lecturers, if I'm being honest with you, would say you're not allowed to do that. You should always have them as different names, right? So this should be status input, location input, and then you don't have to use the this word. What the this word does is it says that's the member variable that belongs privately to that class. That's the parameter. Yes, that's absolutely right. It avoids name conflicts. What have you said, Nick? It refers to the member variable. Spot on. I think constructors should always have the same name, to be honest. Okay, Ethan, that's a good point. And actually, I do agree with you. And we had a very good student. I hope that helps you, Hector. I had a very good student who fell foul in his first year. I mean, get this, he fell foul in the first year with the same teaching team, but he did this dot status equals status. And that's my preferred approach as well. But another lecturer said, no, 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 you should use different names. It was just an arbitrary habit on the part of the lecturer. He was furious, the student was. And I said, it's worth about 1%. So let's just, yeah, it wasn't really even worth making a fuss about. In this case, Ala, it's a good question. The rule should only be, why use different words if that's clear what's going on there? But the thing I find irritating by having to use a different word for the parameters and a different word for the member variable is then you end up just making words up. Right? It does. And the other thing is when you right click it and ask it to generate it, this wasn't written by me. This was written by IntelliJ. So it's a fairly straightforward. Yeah. Okay, so let's keep it simple. So let's come back to the problem I was discussing. Okay, I want my smart light to give me its information in the form of a string that I can come into my smart building, loop through my array, and ask for each of the objects to tell me what's inside it. So I can display a big string, not display, I can return it back to my client, and I can display it on my interface, right? I want to have a method here, which looks like this, console.out, right? It's expecting a string. Inside it, and I haven't written it yet, so it's going to complain, something like display, right? Or disapply, because I have a problem typing words sometimes, right? Okay. I want to have something that looks like that. I don't want it to be any more complicated. Quick question next year, do we go back to Python or do we stick with Java? Well, that's a very good question. Next year, we don't go back to Python. Next year, it depends. Ethan, are you doing computer science? Okay, in comp science, maybe you'll enjoy my second year module. I'm going to let you build your front end in any platform you like. You can do it in a web, you can do it in Android Studio, Xamarin, iOS. The back end, I will give you some legacy code, right, which will be built in Java. It's to do with graph theory, right, linked very strongly to your data structures module. And you can even adapt that and use Dart. You can even use a different platform, but you'll have to just explain it, right? That's all the students had to do. No, sadly not. You know, I'd like to teach some stuff for cybersecurity. Okay, so Tom, let me just quickly show you that again. So let's go back to Smart Light Switch. What I like about the generator is you can just delete it all, right? Watch this. I've written my two, right? I've written my two member variables. Think about it. That's all. Yeah. Okay, so you've got your two member variables, right, Tom? Then right click, generate, start with your getters and setters, select your variable. Do you want to have getters and setters? Say okay, it builds them all for you. And then right click it, generate, go to your constructor and select them both and it builds that for you, right? Okay, so I mean, that's nice and simple. And so that's why we're not, okay, so the question we had was over in our dashboard is I wanted to write a line of code like that, where all I'm doing is I'm outputting everything that's inside it with a single function call for my object. Remember, this is my object, right? I don't want my console to do anything other than say to my server objects, give me this, do this, give me that back, or I'm sending you some stuff to go and do some work. I do not want to be doing it as a console, as a client. I'll give you a very good example. I worked in a software company where the client code was always in Visual Basic because it was just literally a script layer, and the background system was in C++. And so it maintains that server client distinction. All of you, even if you get heavily into web, you'll discover this, that out there in the industry, one of the distinctions they love is backend, server-based coding. You understand how that works. You know how to keep that clean and relevant against front-end stuff, JavaScript, JS, web pages, Android Studio, mobile development, etc. Keeping that separation is crucial to making you a good and confident, you'll come across it all over the place. Anyway, so you can see that's what I want to do, right? So if I come to my smart building and I say, okay, all right, so let's say I want to return a string, and we said we want to create a method called display. Incidentally, in the coursework so far, unless Alex tells me to, she's the moderator, I haven't specified any names of any methods you have to use. You can make them up. Just use sensible ones. This just to give you a bit of freedom, because otherwise it feels too prescriptive. But let's say that I do this, right? And this is a nice type of loop. I've introduced it, I think, in one. And now this is where this type of loop really comes home. Some of you spotted this as a bit like Python. It's called an iterative loop. It doesn't need to have counters. It doesn't use while. It iterates through objects in an array, right? So look how I use it. The object in the array is a, a smart light, right? So I say a smart light, and I want to get an item. I use the colon, then I specify the array. And what that loop will do is every time I go around this loop, it will pull out each of the items from that array. But because these items are objects, I should be able to do this. You notice I can get location, set status, is status, and these are part of its interface. Right now, hold that thought in a minute, for a minute. I could display it by going to each item and writing code and saying get the location, get the this, get the that. But no, don't bother. It's too complicated. Why not just create a simple method in the actual smart light, which does this? Public. Actually, let's try another one. There's another really clever one called toString. Go to generate. There's one called toString. Click on that. Select both variables, say OK, and it generates a simple way of returning all the data. Now the return statement isn't so, I don't want to have that. So let's get rid of that. Let's tidy it up a bit so it looks in the way I want it to. I want it to say status, maybe colon, a little space. Let's have a carriage return. No, let's just have a one of those bars. What are they called? Anyone remember? I use them a lot. Space there, and right at the end, let's use one of those, right? I've just edited a piece of code that I could generate. Pipes, that's it, thank you folks, pipe. So now this has got a method, it's an override. Why is it called an override? It's because within the object, something called an object hierarchy, every object inherits, I don't want to get lost in this because I will give you a lecture on object inheritance, but you won't need it for this coursework because we don't have time to give you the opportunity to really get into it. Next year, you'll get much more chance for it. But anyway, you have built in to object-oriented programs certain standard functions like toString. So if I come over to my smart building now and I do this, I've got my string variable. Some of you are going to say, don't, IntelliJ is going to say, don't use plus equals. But one thing I'm going to say in the coursework is I know it's clumsy, but I'm going to encourage you to create your own mechanisms. You'll see it as a constraint, maybe a little bit annoying. Anyway, item.toString. Now what that does is the object itself within the array gives me back its string data. I then concatenate it into a string. What I might like to do, right, is just add maybe a plus and a space, just so it helps separate out, right? That goes all inside my loop. Nice and easy. Maybe some of you will find the coursework too easy. I do not know, right? That's that one, that closes that one. Okay, and here we need a return statement. So we just return S, okay? I can't just do array list. No, you can't do that. No, you can't be lazy, okay? The whole point is that you're going to get tons of time when you're later on to be lazy and do stuff. So Ethan and anyone else who agrees with that. Yes, so the server, okay, to clear, in this example, the server object is actually smart building. Look over here, come over here. The smart light server object is, yeah, string builder is actually probably one of the only ones I will allow. I modify the coursework to allow string builder because concatenating plus equals strings is just, you know, dumb, okay? And lazy, but it's a concept. That's all it is, right? So maybe string builder, but I need to make sure I remember what you just said to me, Adriano, so I pop it into the coursework constraints. Okay, so the question about the server object is a smart light. So this is really crucial. It's a brilliant question, Theodore. From the point of view of the interface, it never sees the array or the smart light switch. It should never be visible. You never create it inside here and then pass it or get it back or anything like that. It's entirely, yes, and I'll do that in a second. I'll do that in a second, Theodore. Let me make a note to do that, right? Create a separate package, just to help clarify that distinction. Oh, Stefan. Oh my goodness, how are we doing for time? Oh my goodness, we are going on. Okay, all right, let me speed up a bit. Sorry, folks. Okay, so the thing I was saying, please watch this and pay attention to that note thing. In here, in the main, there is no reference to the smart light. It is entirely embedded inside the smart building. Anything you want from it, you have to go through the smart building. Think of it like this, right? You've got a special department somewhere. You can't directly interact with it. You have to go via an intermediate. And that's what the smart building does. It manages it entirely. Okay, so I've got display. That's how I would display. That's how you would see it as a client. Now think about this, okay? I know you've only got 4 minutes, so I'll be quick. Think about it like this. From a client point of view, if this was written on a mobile Android app, for example, yeah, you can't turn a light on without going in the house. Yeah, you can't turn a light on. That's a very good question. Without asking the house and specifying through the house, saying to the house, I want that one, click on that. Now, if it was a graphical user interface, it would be intuitive. But because it's a stupid console, you have to kind of select the option and do a couple of other bits and pieces. It's a bit like a company, if you want a new keyboard, you have to go through the IT department, exactly. But this is how the world works. And the software world uses, it's called delegation of responsibility, both in the business world, but also in the software world. For the lights location, could use a multi-dimension array. Nah. Cable, I don't know what you mean, but if you mean what I think you do, what you mean there, use an array inside there for the location. If you had a complex IP address, for example, yeah, you could in theory. Please be careful you don't end up overcomplicating it. There are several levels. Remember, this is Inception, a dream within a dream. This is the dream inside, the dream of the smart building, which is inside and called and worked within that. So we have already 3 layers. And then if you create the console helper as an object and attach your home to it, then you've got other layers managing it. So there's enough complexity in here to, to justify not having to overcomplicate it. What you should do, okay, I know Stephanie, you've got to go, so I'm going to just speed up. What you should do is when I release the coursework, come to the practicals and ask those questions, okay? Don't risk doing stuff. I've tried to make it really clear in the coursework that I don't need you to complicate it. You don't need to. You want to, some of you should be aiming to get 90 plus. Last year, I had 2 students who almost got 98% for it. And I think this year, I expect at least 10 of you to be able to do that. Excellent, excellent. Okay, yeah. Ethan, always keep on asking me and I will guide you, okay? I do not want to restrict you, but I want to guide you because I think go for the 100%, right? Okay, so Stefan's got to go and I'm just going to wrap up then. 98% due to white space. So that's the gist of what week 7 and 8, 7A and B are. And you build that. And you are building, if you know how to refactor, okay? Yeah, Ethan, I can do that. And we'll do that when we get back, okay? What I would say is work on this 7 and A, and then let's chat. That's pretty cool. What I would say is that build this, and then when you hit with the coursework, whenever it is, just before we come back, you will literally see you refactor some of the objects you've built here. Okay, so you're starting your coursework by tackling these 2 weeks. I hope that was clear, folks. I'm going to stop there. And tomorrow it's catalytics bingo. And